Well, welcome folks. Thanks for joining us. Happy October, happy co-op month. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes to hop on and then we'll get rolling. But excited to see some familiar faces already in the chat. If you're just joining us, you want to let us know where you're joining us from, maybe what co-ops you're connected with. We would love to hear that. So feel free in the chat to let us know what state, what co-op, and what brings you here today. We're very excited to have you all with us. Alrighty. I think it's time to kick off. So again, hello and welcome, and thank you all for joining us for the first webinar in our co-op month series. Today, we're going to be focusing on the Farm Bill. So my name is Emma McCormick, and I'm the Senior Director of Engagement at National Farmers Union. And joining me today is our Education Coordinator, Lisa Buckner. Lisa and I are going to be hanging out in the chat in case you have any questions as we go through today's webinar, or if you need any technical assistance. Our moderator today is Doug O'Brien, the President and CEO of National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA International. And we have a couple of panelists joining us today, including Cheryl Hills, the Executive Director at Region 5 Development Commission. And Dania Davey is going to be joining us a little bit later, the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy at the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. Before we dive into today's topic, I wanted to review some basic housekeeping. We'll be taking time throughout the session to answer any questions you all have, so feel free to be dropping those into the Q&A box. And we would love and encourage you all to share any ideas you have for future webinar topics as they pop into your head, so feel free to use the chat box for that. We are recording this presentation and we will post a copy for you to review at a later date. And just want to note that all chats are also being recorded, so if there are any unanswered questions, we will be sure to capture them and hopefully answer them in the future. If you're unfamiliar with National Farmers Union, our mission is to advocate for family farmers, ranchers, and their communities through education, legislation, and cooperation. We are a grassroots organization and we work on a wide variety of issues that affect American family farmers and rural residents. We highly encourage you to attend some of our other webinars and also check out our website at nfu.org to explore some of the other opportunities and ways to become involved. Doug, I'm now going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Emma. It's really good to be with everyone today. I really appreciate National Farmers Union for creating the space for this conversation and for inviting me and Cheryl and Dania to be part of the conversation. It's a really important topic, one that makes all the sense in the world given that NFU is hosting, given the triangle of legislation, education, and cooperation. And so I should mention also that it's even a greater honor to be part of this. Emma actually is a board member for the National Cooperative Business Association, who I work for. NCBA-CLUSA is the apex association for all kinds of cooperatives in the United States, including farmer cooperatives and rural electrics and food cooperatives and credit unions and worker cooperatives and housing cooperatives and on and on. You know, the thing that all of those types of businesses that I just named have in common is the people who use the business are the ones who control and own the business and the ones who benefit from the business. And that is the distinctive model of cooperatives. And it's a model that has been very well used in rural America, in rural United States. And I think that's really the conversation today is thinking about, you know, how have people in rural communities utilized cooperatives to improve their livelihoods, to increase their economic opportunity, and probably more importantly, you know, in the future, what's that place, and how does legislation, in particular the Farm Bill, you know, how might that affect people's ability to utilize cooperatives to solve some of the problems or capture some of the opportunities that they see in rural places. Just a couple quick examples of farm bills passed or you know, federal legislation passed. I mentioned two different types of co-ops that are really prominent in rural America. Farmer cooperatives, of course, you know, perhaps 50% of all the food that we consume in the United States is touched by a farmer-owned cooperative at some point, whether that's a marketing cooperative or a processing, a distribution cooperative. Farmers, of course, use cooperatives to get their inputs, their seeds, the fertilizer, the energy, the fuels that they have. It's that farmers working together. It's so critical. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because farmers looked at models from across the world, in this case at that time, probably from Northern European countries, and they looked at them because they knew about them. I mean, these were farmers from Finland, from Norway, from Northern Europe, who had just within a generation or two really adopted the cooperative business model. They had come to the US at that time, and they were in a position of real threat in terms of where and how they could engage within the economy. This was a time when we were moving from an agrarian kind of agriculture economy into a more industrial economy, and the big players had more and more market power. And farmers realized that the only way that they could probably survive is if they came together and they actually owned and controlled more of that, those links within the food chain. In fast forward today, as I mentioned, farmer cooperatives are such an important part of the farm economy and the rural economy. Another example is about a generation later, farmers wanted to participate in the modern economy, which included utilizing electricity. And in 1930, 10% of rural families, farm families, had access to electricity, where 90% of people in cities had access to electricity. Farmers used cooperatives, and they were able to persuade the legislative environment to create really a whole kind of scaffolding of policy to support farmers and rural people building out their own energy distribution and generation system, what we know now as the rural electric cooperatives. And that meant technical assistance. It meant helping people organize these cooperatives. It meant subsidized credit. And even today, there's a whole agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture called the Rural Utility Service that largely serves rural electric cooperatives. It's one of the main channels. I mean, just to bring it right to today, or at least about 2 or 3 weeks ago, when the federal government was looking to capture the opportunity of accelerating change in behavior relative to climate change, they looked to the Rural Utility Service and they looked to rural cooperatives to really to be able to invest in new technologies and to make sure that that rural people could contribute to the solutions around climate change that's so sorely needed. These are just a couple. I mentioned farmer cooperatives. Still today, USDA continues to support farmer cooperatives through a whole, there's a group of people that do an agriculture census around agriculture cooperatives. There's a group of people that attend the Rural Cooperative Development Grant Program that was created about 25 or 30 years ago in the Farm Bill that helps nonprofits in rural places help people create cooperatives. That's another Farm Bill example. So there's a lot of examples in the past. I think we need to think about how could we make sure that there's policy in the future so that more people in rural places could use cooperatives. And I'll think I have some more examples of how they could be used, but I want to pause and introduce my really good friend Cheryl Hills, who is not only a leader in economic development in her region in Minnesota, but truly a leader, a thought leader in rural economic development throughout the country. And I'd love to hear from Cheryl, and then I think we can just get the conversation going. Let's get the chat going. And Cheryl.
Thanks, Doug. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you very much. I'm excited to see all the folks on the chat that are popping up. So yes, in addition to some of the cooperative structures that you mentioned that are critically important to our economies, urban and rural and national economies, Doug, it's been interesting in Minnesota, at least, which is a very co-op friendly state. And there are several across the nation, but we sort of latched on to that approach to cooperative structures decades ago, early onsets, to thinking about how now, beyond those producer co-ops that you talked about and shared, we know a lot more about food co-ops, right? Grocery stores, particularly for rural places that are struggling to maintain food access points in grocery stores that utilize commodities from small and mid-sized producers. And so that's really an exciting food co-op sort of model that's been expanding and really over the last, I would say, 20 years more so. I also am really excited about energy co-ops that are starting to frame up. So communities and private sector companies who are looking to expand their energy options. And I don't mean the electrical co-ops as you define. I'm talking about groups of folks that want to deploy solar or want to deploy, a specific type of renewable energy, and they want to utilize tax credit investors. And so in order to utilize tax credit investors, you need an economy of scale. In rural communities, we don't have great big huge airports to put solar on top of. So a lot of times you need a lot of mid-sized buildings, government buildings, schools, et cetera. So groups that are coming together to create cooperatives that are around climate change are really exciting. I think that's emerging, and certainly able to lean on your organization, Doug, and understand how to create a co-op, a legal structure of a co-op. And then I'm really excited also about this notion of business cooperatives popping up more as well. So groups of businesses outside of an industry like renewable energy, which I referred to, but those companies that are coming together to create a cooperative structure for, yes, some of the same things that our farmers did it for, buying power, right? Marketing, shared marketing, some of those other things that were advantageous to the producer groups. Those business co-ops are really interesting, particularly, Doug, for regions that have a tourism based economy or outdoor recreation based economy, like parts of Michigan and other states, right? Like where it's really tourism driven. That's retail. And a lot of times retail are not profitable, and they're profitable, but they're not, high wage jobs, right? And so livelihoods of individuals are not expanded exponentially in that industry of retail as they are in other industries. That's why economic development folks push for things like manufacturing or even food manufacturing or other types of industries versus retail. That's why EDA asks us to diversify economies where there's a high amounts of retail, because of the livelihoods of the people that are not able to participate in that sharing of wealth. Business co-ops in the retail sector, there isn't a sector out there that isn't struggling for workforce, right? Not one, not private, public, or nonprofit. That said, retail are suffering most when there's a labor shortage, and because people don't want to work for $15 an hour when they can come in at medium skills for something higher. And so they're starting to think about, how do we do co-ops where employees can retain part of the profit, right? So that is a really big shift that I think we have an opportunity to lift up and to support as the next farm bill is being crafted, or even lean on the amazing talent and the structures that are already here, like your organization, Doug. So I'll stop there for a minute or two, okay?
That's great. Thank you, Cheryl. I might just riff off a couple of those excellent points, and invite folks to comment, ask questions in the chat as we do so. Really good point around what we call worker cooperatives. So people in rural America are very familiar with producer cooperatives, which are farmers who own and control their own business, which in many ways is really a small business, right? I mean, there are a bunch of small business firms that come together for scale, and we're also really familiar with consumer co-ops. Some people might not think about it so much, but rural electric cooperatives are indeed consumer co-ops. They're consumers of electricity that own and control that business. Less familiar with worker co-ops. It's the fastest growing sector in the United States. So these are co-ops that are owned and controlled by the people who work at the business. Still relatively small, maybe 1,000 of those in the total, the total of perhaps 35,000 co-ops we have in the country. About 1,000 are worker co-ops, but they are growing faster. And there's more interest in the policy sphere for the reasons that Cheryl laid out. I think that it gives people an opportunity to capture more of the entrepreneurial profit. It gives people an opportunity to actually have more say about their business. A lot of times in worker cooperatives, while the wage or the economic return for that worker might be greater. What people will report is what they appreciate even more is some say in their hours and their types of benefits and their ways, which a lot of these jobs, really critical jobs, whether they're retail jobs, care sector jobs, those are very hard jobs, that lack that sometimes lack good ladder up to management, et cetera. And these worker co-ops can really address some of that. A couple things I want to mention in the rural sphere very quickly is co-op conversions. Something that we've been talking about in the cooperative community for a number of years now is the silver tsunami. The numbers are really impressive and not on the top of my head in terms of the millions of small businesses from the baby boomer generation that will be transferred in this next 5 to 12 years. Millions of businesses, small businesses, most of them mom and pop type of businesses, and they will be transferred. They're either going to be sold to another business, perhaps to a larger regional or national business, or they'll close down. And sadly, we from rural America, we know that a lot of times a small business, even if it pencils out, there's not a buyer because that buyer that's going to move to that small community doesn't necessarily, they're not easy to find. More and more, we're looking to co-op conversions. What does that means? That means taking this, a hardware store, a small independent grocery store, even a bar or a restaurant that's really critical, a pillar of that community. And the people in the community, they choose to buy and own and control that business. And it can be the consumers, it can be the workers. And in fact, we see some examples now of multi-stakeholders. So you actually have a business that's owned and controlled by the workers and the consumers. And they have, the governance structure is very defined and thought about out front. So that co-op conversions, I think, is really critical opportunity for rural places. I mentioned a little bit ago the care sector. Just recently, as Emma knows very well, I had an opportunity to join about 20 co-op leaders from across the country to a region of Italy called the Emilia-Romagna region, which is kind of where Bologna and Parma, very co-op rich area. 30 to 50% of their care sector is taken care of by co-ops. And these are co-ops that include as members the workers and the families that are served. So think about childcare, dependent care, elder care, caring for people who are differently abled. They're actually cooperatives that do this work. We've been doing work here at NCBA-CLUSA along with the Cooperative Development Foundation, our 501c3 arm, for about 6 or 7 years, partnering with a lot of entities on home care in rural places. A lot of interest, but the policy infrastructure around it makes it such that it's very difficult to scale. And these are the kind of things that I think we can think about in our policy environment in the Farm Bill and in other places.
One of the opportunities that I think we have going forward as a lender, and we are an economic development district, and so we've been doing loans for over 30 years, Doug, and their economic development districts are all over the nation, as well as CDFIs and other lending arms, right? Other great, even our red leg dollars that come from the utilities. And so there's a lot of lending partners out there at least in rural. And one of the really cool opportunities is to think about how can we take those dollars and offer extremely favorable terms, even a higher priority favorable terms to cooperative structures as a way to inspire those and utilizing those favorable terms, understanding that we are incentivizing some of this. And so I think that's a really exciting opportunity in our region when the American Rescue and CARES Act dollars came down and we tried this, right? We offered very extremely favorable terms to businesses, 0% interest for $250,000 loans, and they were gobbled up pretty quickly, but they were prioritized by companies that would create cooperative structures, employee-owned and or community-owned cooperative structures. And that is a way for us to think about all of these lending arms and where the money comes from lots of different federal agencies, to think about how can we incentivize cooperative structures, because one of the things that you just said was really critical, in that we can invest in cooperative structures for elder care, which is a really cool model, right? To think about doing more of that. But without childcare, you can't get the employees to work at the elder care facilities. And so trying to think about how we create childcare cooperative structures that allow us to at least bring the workforce in to be able to participate in other industries is also really exciting. So we did prioritize loans to childcare facilities and elder care facilities that had a desire to be a cooperative structure. You know, when you throw an idea out there like that, you think it's never going to land, or people are going to think you're nuts. And then the money went out the door just like that. And that really was exciting to be thinking about. And I'm also really excited about how we can utilize existing programs, like USDA has some programs through rural development, the rural business development grants, and others that can offer technical assistance to these groups that are trying to figure out how to do these innovative approaches. You know, people will see a large loan that they can get for very favorable terms and then think, oh golly, now I've got all the attorney fees to create these cooperative structures, and there's a few barriers. But there are other programs and organizations like yours that walk them through that, and other programs that can help offer that technical assistance to get them over that those challenges, right, to develop this. But I think there's some real promise in thinking about, you know, how can we do more of the co-op structures as we're trying to, again, what we're talking about, a lot of coal communities, right, rebuilding economies, and we're talking about build back better in some places, communities, and now we've got the rural partner networks and resources, and there's so many different types of ways for us to rebuild and reinvigorate economies right now, that this should be a conversation that is part of all those planning discussions. Is a cooperative structure in a benefit to what we're trying to create in this, whether it's a 5-county or 4-state regional economies? And so those are really good questions for not only those with funds to do loans, but planners that are out there working with communities to be asking those kinds of questions as well, large or small scale, and through all these wonderful programs. Doug.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, no, those are great points. I mean, I think following on that points, I want to think about two sectors in particular. One's the energy sector, particularly as it relates to climate, and then the other one is the food system. You know, on the energy sector, as I mentioned, the recent legislation in particular, known as the Inflation Reduction Act, provided very significant resources to rural electric cooperatives, yes, but also to rural businesses generally under the REAP program, especially. Some really significant resources, kind of historic resources. I know the folks at USDA are thinking about how to most effectively administer those, and people on this call probably know that the Rural Energy for America program, it provides resources to primarily rural businesses, and that could be a co-op, it could be an LLC, it could be a mom and pop, to invest in renovation for energy efficiency or renewable energy projects. And certainly a lot of co-ops have taken advantage of that. I think there's opportunity for more. In sort of as a segue to agriculture and food system, I'll talk about the climate smart agriculture program and projects that were recently announced by USDA, I guess about a month ago or so. It's $1 billion to, I'm going to get this number wrong, but I'm going to say 40 different entities that that will accelerate and incent farmers, primarily people who are doing agriculture production, to adopt climate smart type of practices. What I think is critical for the cooperative community, and I think probably in the next farm bill we need to think about this, is how farmers, perhaps and others kind of in that sector, can use cooperatives to ensure that as many of the new resources that are coming in, whether that's public resources or private resources, are able to stay in those rural communities. You know, and in one way, at the end of the day, that's what cooperatives are really all about, is making sure that those rural communities are the ultimate beneficiary of economic activity, public policy, et cetera. And I think we you know, I can tell you from NCBA-CLUSA, that's what we're really focused on, working with National Farmers Union, working with some other entities to make sure that that can happen. And then I'll just talk about food system just a little bit. I see some of my friends from food co-op community on here. We, you know, using the cooperative business model to ensure that more people can access healthy food. You know, there's been really good strides in the last 2 or 3 farm bills, including what's known as HIFI, the Healthy Food and Finance Initiative. And some food co-ops have been able to take part in that. A lot of credit unions, which of course are financial cooperatives, have CDFIs, CDFI credit unions have been able to take advantage of that. You know, I think we actually, we're looking at that model, the HIFI model. Is there something around that model that we can learn in terms of accelerating co-op development? That HIFI model kind of partners technical assistance with really robust, you know, essentially subsidized grant and loan. And you know, and it's made a real difference. And I think it's shown some real good examples of what could happen out there. And so we're, you know, that's another thing that we're thinking about at NCBA-CLUSA in the food system.
Yeah, we have a question in the Q&A and wanted to present it to you both. So this comes from Annie Hoy. Hi, Annie. How would you approach small rural leaders, city councils, for example, to address these opportunities in home care, childcare, food access, and some of the other examples we've been talking about?
So
That's a great question, Annie. Doug, do you want to take it? You want me
no,
to
I
hit
think
it
Cheryl,
first?
this
Okay.
is it. This
Okay.
is really your bailiwick.
Yes.
These are your people.
These are my people.
The local
That's
economic
right.
leaders. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. You know, the first thing that I do when I go into a city council meeting, and even if towns of 500, it's asking them what's keeping them up at night. What is keeping you up at night? What's the primary things that are really making you lose some sleep and cause some anxiety? And they'll list several things off, right? And then we talk about if we, you know, need to prioritize those, where we're going to do that, and how do we make sure that as we are addressing those issues, whether it's broadband or food access or whatever it is, workforce attraction or whatever the housing, right, childcare, all these big issues, and we understand what's keeping them up at night and we prioritize those, we start asking ourselves, who are we actually trying to serve here? And does the who matter? Right? That's some of the questions that we ask. And if the who matters, then we start talking about the cooperative structures under a series of other types of strategies to do economic development that keeps that wealth, to Doug's point earlier, in those rural communities, right? And that's important. And so I think we also talk a lot about, you know, that being a sub-regional or regional scale, and the words matter, but it does start with those questions and prioritizing and asking them, what are the things that they're concerned about, and then who are you actually trying to serve? Like, you know, nobody's trying to, you know, provide transit for those that aren't going to use transit, right? So if you're looking at transportation systems or housing or whatever it is, you're always looking at the highest need areas, and then drilling down a little bit more, that is to, and who should benefit from these systems or this. And when it comes to those kinds of questions, then they want it to be members of their community. The city council people, of course, want it to be constituents, people who vote, right? That's how it works. And so, you know, that's where we come back to the co-op model being a really solid approach to retaining wealth in communities, and why we work so much with, like Doug was just saying, the food co-ops and convening them on a regional scale to even address how can they do things together, even though they're individual food co-ops across the, you know, 5-county area. How can they work together, even multiplying that co-op sort of model in a different scale? I'll just do a shout out, Doug, before you answer that question too, to even like, I'm a big fan of the Minnesota Farmers Union, and they don't pay me to say that, but they definitely have been thinking about, even when we receive dollars to do a mobile meat slaughtering program, workforce training program with some community colleges in the state, there's a component of, okay, as we launch this and evolve it, can this be a cooperative structure? And so we're having those conversations now. And that's exciting to even have, players who might not see themselves in this space of creating co-ops with their own assets, the way our farmers union does.
Mm-hmm.
That's fun. And that's, we take those examples, by the way, back to those city councils.
Mm-hmm. And that actually, that's a great segue, Cheryl, that when that question, how do you approach city council, local leaders, examples, of course, is key. Show them that it's been done someplace else. How do you find those examples? You can find them, here at NCBA-CLUSA. We'd certainly be happy to help you surface some examples that would be most relevant. But also, there's a whole network of cooperative development organizations called Cooperation Works. There's about 40, mostly 501c3 nonprofit associations that focus on cooperative development. Many of them are recipients of the Rural Cooperative Development Grant, which is a grant designed to help more people use and develop cooperatives in rural places. These are places, and if you could look up their network or association is known as Cooperation Works, and you could find the one in your footprint. Almost every state has one. At least they do cover the entire of the United States, so they're good people to kind of pull in and have a conversation with some of your local leaders about what some of this might look like. I might mention just a couple other things very quickly. And this is related to some work with USDA that NCBA-CLUSA is involved with, as well as the Federation for Southern Cooperatives and many others. About a year and a half ago, well, actually, no, now just a year ago, we entered into a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to support historically underserved farmers. So we have an effort going on now to help build out the ecosystem of cooperative development in historically underserved communities, whether that's Hispanic farmers, Hmong farmers, women farmers, in other communities. And so that idea is it's a 5-year effort to really, it's kind of a train the trainer to build the capacity within those communities to do co-op development. And I did want to mention that because that's whatever happens in policy in the future in the next farm bill, we do need to, as co-op development typically has been, it focuses on those communities that tend to have been either marginalized or have a harder time participating fully in the economy. And I think that's something that needs to continue in the future as well. The last thing I'll mention, and again, this is an example that I was able to see in Italy a couple of weeks ago. This is a newer type of co-op that they have there, and it's called community co-ops, and they're for more remote rural regions. We don't think of Italy as a great big country, but they indeed have, there's more mountainous regions. And just like here in the United States, the economy evolves, and many times there's parts of the rural regions that, if you will, the economy is kind of moving away from them. They're using what they're calling community co-ops as an answer. It's a multi-function co-op, really, and I think it's bringing and I wasn't able to get totally into the details on it, but it answers some of that question that we face in rural communities many times, that we just, a town of 500 or 1,200, there just is not the capacity to put together the strategy, to apply for the grants, to to kind of net the vital net that is required for robust community economic development, and that's what these community co-ops are helping to do. It looks like kind of a public-private partnership, but I think it's something that we can learn from, whether it's in this farm bill or going forward.
So Doug, I have a question. The community co-ops, those are made up of members from the community and the, so private, public, nonprofit sectors and members, general members of a community.
I think it is multi-stakeholder, and there is examples. You see these in Europe more often, where they actually they can have public sector as part of the co-op. It gets we don't have time today, but the governance of it gets really interesting really fast in terms of who has voting rights, who gets the benefits, you know, who has. I mean, just to get real kind of co-op and wonky on you is if there's reserved. You know, patronage, there's equity, who has control of that equity, do individuals actually have a right to it, etc. So but they really, there are places around the country that are really pushing you know, utilizing the democratic governance of co-ops to solve community problems in some different ways, and we can always learn, you know. So
that's very interesting, because it could transcend some of the issues that we were talking about. That community co-op could address childcare simultaneously while addressing elder care, producers, food. Very cool.
Yeah. So good. Well, we're at almost 3:40, and I want to be super respectful of everyone's time. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate. I just want to double check, Emma, if there's anything that's occurred in the chat, and kind of at the same time, maybe do a last call for folks. If there's any comments or questions that you have, now would be the moment to pose them.
Yeah, no new questions in the chat, but I can do a little bit of a wrap up. And if, we got something coming through. We've got a few questions coming through now, so let's take a peek. What role does the Farm Bill play in addressing the things that are keeping folks up at night? Is the first question we have in the chat.
Oh, that's a good question. Maybe I'll take the first swing. Cheryl, I'll hand it over to you. The Farm Bill, of course, is it's a very comprehensive piece of legislation that comes around about every 5 years. That certainly deals with, as its name implies, although I think somewhat inaccurately, it has a lot to do with farms. It helps farmers deal with the inherent risk around agriculture, with different types of commodity and insurance programs. It has a full set of conservation programs to incent and partner with farmers on soil conservation, water conservation, and now I think more and more on climate activity related to climate change. And then it goes on and on. Another big piece is on rural development. There's a title in the Farm Bill, the rural development title, that deals with a lot of the programs that we're talking about now. It's the small business programs, the infrastructure programs, the renewable energy programs, generally the community economic development programs. And the Farm Bill in the last few years has been the bill that has affected co-ops more than any other, because the legacy co-op policy resides at USDA, and the Farm Bill is the big reauthorization statute, you know, for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Farm Bill also deals with the food programs, most prominently the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and many others. But I guess that's a quick answer, maybe not that quick. Cheryl, what did I miss? A whole bunch.
Well, no, you hit all the big buckets for sure. I think the other things that keep people up at night is what Doug was talking about earlier about those underserved, underrepresented populations, and the Farm Bill has an opportunity to prioritize dollars towards areas and people, right? And so that's really important. The RD side, the rural development side, as Doug said, does address a lot of those issues. And one of the things I like about the RD side and the Farm Bill is that it also offers dollars for those cooperatives, whether they're community cooperatives or just communities in general, to receive technical assistance for people within their regions or their parts of the state that can help them go after those resources and investments and secure dollars from those programs. And so literally there are some, not very many, but a few good ones, few programs in the Farm Bill that actually support technical assistance and capacity building and strengthening of communities. And so those are the two things I think I wanted to add on to there, Doug, is the equity piece and the TA part of it that supports.
Yeah, and that TA could include cooperative development as you
Absolutely.
suggest there. So yeah, thanks, Cheryl.
We had a question about co-op awareness, raising awareness on ways to start co-ops, especially for folks who maybe have never heard about the co-op business model. I'm just curious if you all have had success stories or lessons learned that you would want to share with folks.
Well, first of all, happy Cooperative Month. October is Cooperative Month. The U.S. The Secretary of Vilsack actually signed a proclamation. He delivered at our annual conference last week, or the deputy, actually, the number 2 person, Deputy Secretary Brown, delivered. Yeah, candidly, it's a challenge within the co-op world to make sure that people understand what cooperatives is. One of the 7 principles we have is education, training, and it's something that co-ops have a responsibility to make sure that more and more people always have the ability to understand about cooperatives. National Farmers Union has always, but I think in particular this last few years, has done a fantastic job of increasing and raising awareness about cooperatives. I mean, just a few basic. Take a look at NCBA-CLUSA.coop or NCBA.coop. And we've got a bunch of resources there. There's actually, we're very involved with a domain called .coop, and look that up, .coop, and they have a bunch of resources on, including a bunch of videos on kind of how to talk about cooperatives. And then I guess the last thing I would say is reach out to that local co-op development organization, that CDO, from Cooperation Works that I mentioned before. And then if you know of an example, that's always the best, is point to somebody else. And if you can bring a farmer who's been involved in a co-op and really understands her or his role in the co-op, because not every farmer who is a part of a co-op fully understands their role, but have somebody who's really been involved in the governance of it, that peer learning is always the very, very best.
I think there's a lot of resources out there to help folks become and understand more about the cooperative structure, and partners that would give presentations or give slide decks of presentations that help us understand more about the advantageous approaches. One of the things I didn't want to forget to mention in the short time left is that the thing about the Farm Bill question as well is that it's not all things for all needs. And so what I like is to be able to take that Farm Bill and say, hey, Minnesota Department of Agriculture, here's what the Farm Bill isn't going to be able to provide for us here in this state, like campaigns around why people should shop at food co-ops, or, other types of materials or needs that cooperative structures have once they've been created and they're trying to do their business. Like, there's this continued awareness to the public, not just about the structure, but about why they should purchase from these cooperative ventures. And so I think talking with your state departments of agriculture to helping them understand what the Farm Bill is also an opportunity for policy wonks in this space of the ag economy to advocate for other kinds of programs out of the state resources to be able to advance the profitability of co-ops, because that's what keeps them around.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. It has been great hanging out with you, and thank you for coming here and sharing these resources and answering our questions today. I also want to give a shout out to Dania. Unfortunately, she got stuck with some travel pains, so she is not able to join us today, but still want to thank her and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives for all the work that they do in this space as well. And we're going to be keeping these webinars going. We have another Co-op Month webinar scheduled called Cultivating Community. Cooperative leaders tell their story. We're going to be putting a link in the chat for that, and hopefully we're going to see you all there. And we're also going to be sharing a link to our survey. We would love to hear more from folks about what they hope to see in the future of this series. So again, thank you, Doug and Cheryl. Thank you everyone for joining us, and happy Co-op Month, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, NFU. Thank you, Cheryl. Everybody have a good day.